March 1945. Somewhere in the forests of central Germany, the convoy rolled to a halt on a muddy track car between bare birch trees. The afternoon light slanted low through the branches, pale and cold, casting skeletal shadows across the canvas-covered trucks. Inside the vehicles, 43 women sat in silence. Their faces were gaunt, their eyes hollow with exhaustion. They wore the threadbare remnants of wear-marked auxiliary uniforms, gray wool coats frayed at the cuffs, trousers patched with burlap, boots held together with wire and hope. Some of them stared at their hands. Others stared at nothing at all. The smell inside the trucks was acrid and intimate. Unwashed bodies, stale sweat, the iron tang of blood from untreated wounds. No one spoke. There was nothing left to say. Outside, American voices called out in English. Boot steps crunched on frozen mud. A canvas flap was pulled back, and cold air rushed in, carried with it the scent of diesel fuel and something else. Something unfamiliar and sharp. Soap. Clean soap. One of the women, a signals operator named Greta Hoffman, would later recall that scent as the first thing that made her believe the war might truly be over. Not the surrender, not the capture, but that smell, so ordinary, so impossible, that belonged to a world she had forgotten existed. The American soldier who opened the truck wore a helmet pushed back on his head, and an expression that seemed almost apologetic. He was young, perhaps 22, with a soft jawline and dirt under his fingernails. He gestured for the women to climb down. His movements were careful, measured, as though he were handling something fragile. When one of the older women stumbled on the tailgate, he reached out instinctively to steady her. She flinched. He pulled his hand back. The moment hung between them, awkward, uncertain, laden with everything the war had taught them about trust. Behind him, other soldiers were setting up a canvas tent on the side of the road. Inside, Greta could see folded blankets, wooden crates, a steel drum that steamed in the cold air. One of the American soldiers was filling tin basins with hot water from the drum. Another was laying out small wrap bars on a makeshift table constructed from ammunition boxes. White bars, soap, towels folded in neat stacks. The absurdity of it struck Greta like a physical blow. For 3 years, she had lived in a world where water was a luxury measured in cupfuls, where soap was a memory, where the concept of cleanliness had become an abstract idea divorced from daily reality. And now, here, in the middle of a forest in a country that just lost everything, American soldiers were offering her a bath. She looked at the other women. Some of them were crying. Others stood frozen, unable to process what they were seeing. One woman, a Ukrainian conscript named Oksana, laughed, a single, sharp bark of sound that echoed to the trees and then died. The American soldier with the soft jaw looked uncomfortable. He said something in English, then repeated it more slowly, as if volume and patience could bridge the language gap. A translator appeared, a German-American sergeant with a Bavarian accent, so thick it sounded like a parody. He cleared his throat. "You will be processed here," he said. "You will be given an opportunity to wash. There is hot water. There is soap. There are clean towels. You will be treated in accordance with the Geneva Convention." Geneva Convention. The words floated in the air like something from another lifetime. Greta remembered lectures at the auxiliary training camp in 1942. Stern-faced officers explaining the rules of war, the protections afforded to prisoners, the civilized framework that was supposed to govern even the uncivilized business of killing. It had all seemed theoretical then, a gentleman's agreement from a more innocent age. And then the war had swallowed everything. The rules, the framework, the innocence, and spat back only survival. But now, standing in the cold March air, staring at those white bars of soap, Greta wondered if perhaps some fragment of that old world had survived after all. To understand the shock those women felt, it is necessary to step back, not just months, but years, into machinery of total war that had consumed Europe and the world beyond it. By March 1945, the Third Reich was collapsing like a house built on sand. The Eastern Front had disintegrated. Soviet armies were grinding westward with the slow, inexorable momentum of a glacier, crushing everything in their path. In the West, American and British forces had crossed the Rhine. The Luftwaffe was a ghost. The Wehrmacht was a skeleton. And yet the war continued, because surrender was unthinkable and because the machinery of state violence, once set in motion, is difficult to stop. For the women caught in that machinery, the experience was uniquely harrowing. History often forgets them. The female auxiliaries, the nurses, the communication specialists, the clerks and translators and factory workers who kept the war machine running. They were not soldiers in the traditional sense, but they wore uniforms. They served under military discipline. And when the collapse came, they were swept up in the same chaotic retreat as their male counterparts. Thousands of them fled westward in the final months of the war, desperate to surrender to the Americans or British rather than face the Red Army. The stories that came out of the East, stories of mass rape, of summary executions, of women violated and murdered in act of revenge of the Wehrmacht's own atrocities, had spread like wildfire through the retreating German forces. Whether exaggerated or not, those stories shaped decisions. They shaped the direction of flight. And they shaped the expectations of the women who found themselves in American custody in the spring of 1945. Greta Hoffman had been a signals operator attached to a Wehrmacht communications unit stationed near Kassel. She was 24 years old, the daughter of a schoolteacher from Heidelberg. She had joined the Women's Auxiliary Corps in 1942, motivated not by ideology but by practicality. Her father had been conscripted, her brother was missing on the Eastern Front, and the military offered food, shelter, and a monthly stipend that she could send home to her mother. For 3 years, she had lived in a world of codes and radio static, decoding messages, tracking supply routes, filing reports. It was tedious work, mind-numbing in its repetition, but it had kept her away from the front lines, until the front lines came to her. In February 1945, as American forces pushed deeper into Germany, her unit was ordered to evacuate. They packed what they could carry and joined the Great Exodus. Military vehicles, civilian refugees, wounded soldiers, all flowing westward in a river of desperation. The roads were choked with people. The Allies bombed the roads during the day, so they moved at night, headlights off, navigating by moonlight and instinct. Greta remembered the sound of those nights, the crunch of boots on frozen earth, the crying of children, the distant rumble of artillery, the occasional scream when a vehicle went off the road and rolled into a ditch. She remembered the cold, which seeped through her coat and settled in her bones. And she remembered the hunger, which gnawed at her belly like a living thing. By the time they were captured in early March, Greta had not bathed in 6 weeks. She had not changed her clothes in 3. Her underwear was stiff with dried sweat and menstrual blood. Medical care was primitive. Soap, toothpaste, toilet paper, the mundane necessities of hygiene, had long since vanished. Soldiers washed in rivers when they could, or did not wash at all. Women made do with rags during their periods. Lice were universal. Disease was rampant. The idea of hot water was a fantasy. The idea of clean towels was absurd. And yet here were the Americans, in the middle of a war zone, in the middle of a military operation, distributing soap as if it were the most natural thing in the world. As if prisoners, enemy prisoners, German prisoners, women who had worked to keep the Wehrmacht functioning, deserved to be clean. The implications were staggering. It suggested society with such abundance, such organizational capacity, that it could afford to extend basic human dignity even to its enemies. It suggested a value system in which cleanliness, health, and hygiene were not luxuries reserved for victors, but rights afforded even to the vanquished. Greta thought about this as she stood in the tent, holding the towel, surrounded by the sounds of women weeping and washing and whispering to one another in disbelief. She thought about the propaganda she had heard for years, the stories of American weakness, American decadence, American mongrel inferiority. She thought about the rhetoric that had painted the enemy as brutal, uncivilized, a threat to European culture. And she thought about the young American soldier with the soft jaw who had flinched when the older woman stumbled, who had reached out to help not because he was ordered to, but because it seemed to him the decent thing to do. The soap was white. The towels were white. The contrast was almost blinding. The processing continued through the afternoon. The women were divided into groups, photographed, interrogated briefly by intelligence officers who seemed more bored than hostile. Their personal effects were catalogued. The few items they still possessed, the tattered letters from home, the photographs of loved ones. Greta had a picture of her brother, taken before he shipped out to the East. She had carried it through 3 years of war, wrapped in oilcloth to protect it from the rain. When the American officer looked at it, he paused. He said something to the translator. The translator asked if Greta knew where her brother was. She shook her head. The officer handed the photograph back. He said something else. The translator repeated it. "I hope he made it home." It was such a small thing, that sentence, but it lodged in Greta's mind like a splinter. The officer was American. Her brother had been fighting against Americans or British or Soviets. She did not even know which front he had died on, if he had died at all. And yet this American officer could still express hope for his survival, could still acknowledge him as a human being, as someone worth mourning. The propaganda had never prepared her for that. The propaganda had taught her to expect hatred, cruelty, revenge. It had not taught her to expect compassion. After processing, the women were loaded onto different trucks, American trucks this time, with bench seats and canvas covers that did not leak. They were driven to a temporary holding facility, a commandeered German barracks that had been converted into a prisoner of war camp. The camp was surrounded by barbed wire, guarded by soldiers with rifles, unmistakably a prison. But inside it was clean. The barracks had been swept. The latrines had been disinfected. There were cots with mattresses, thin military-issue mattresses, but mattresses nonetheless. There were blankets, and there was food. The food was the second revelation. Greta had not eaten a full meal in weeks. The Wehrmacht rations had dwindled to nothing in the final retreat. Watery soup, stale bread, sometimes nothing at all. She had grown accustomed to the hollow ache in her stomach, the light-headed dizziness that came with constant hunger. She had watched women around her grow thin and weak, their bodies consuming themselves to stay alive. The Americans served dinner in a mess hall attached to the barracks. The women lined up with metal trays, shuffling forward in silence, still uncertain, still waiting for the other shoe to drop. And then they reached the serving line, and Greta saw what was being ladled onto the trays. Soup, thick with vegetables and meat. Bread, white bread, soft and fresh. Potatoes, mashed with butter. And, impossibly, a piece of chocolate. A single square of American military chocolate, wrapped in brown paper. Greta stared at the chocolate. She had not seen chocolate since 1943. She had almost forgotten what it looked like. The American soldier behind the serving line, a black man with a Louisiana accent she could not understand but that sounded like music, grinned at her expression and said something that made the other soldiers laugh. He placed a second square of chocolate on her tray. Then he winked. She carried her tray to a table in a daze. She sat down. She looked at the food. And then she ate, slowly, methodically, forcing herself not to devour it all at once because she knew her stomach, shrunken and weak, would rebel. The soup was hot and rich, tasting of beef and onions. The bread was soft and slightly sweet. The potatoes were creamy and warm. And the chocolate melted on her tongue, dark and bitter, and sweet all at once, a taste so intense it almost hurt. Around her, the other women were eating in silence. Some of them were crying again. Others ate mechanically, their faces blank. Elsa, the young woman who had cried in the washing tent, took one bite of bread and then vomited. She apologized, humiliated, but the American medic came over immediately with a damp cloth and a reassuring pat on the shoulder. He said something to her in English, his tone gentle. He brought her a cup of water. He told her, through the translator, to eat slowly, to let her stomach adjust. It was such a small act of kindness, but it was one of many, and cumulatively, those small acts began to erode the wall of fear and suspicion the women had built around themselves. They began to realize that this was not a trap, that the Americans were not playing a cruel game, fattening them up before the real horrors began, that the soap, the towels, the hot food, the clean bunks, was simply the baseline standard of how the Americans treated prisoners. The nights were the hardest. In the darkness, alone with her thoughts, Greta found herself grappling with questions that had no easy answers. She thought about the war, about the side she had served, about the things she had known, and the things she had pretended not to know. She had never been a Nazi. She had never joined the party, never raised her arm in salute with any real conviction. She had been a signals operator, a functionary, a cog in a machine she had not built and did not control. She had told herself that she was not responsible for what that machine did, that she was just trying to survive. But lying in the dark, wrapped in a clean American blanket, the scent of soap still lingering on her skin, she could not escape the nagging guilt that whispered in the back of her mind. She had served the Wehrmacht. She had helped transmit the orders that kept the war machine running. And while she had never pulled a trigger, never hurt anyone directly, she had been part of the system. She had enabled it, however passively, however reluctantly. And now that system had been defeated, crushed, annihilated. Her hair was matted and greasy, infested with lice that crawled across her scalp in the dark. Her skin itched constantly. She had open sores on her feet from marching in boots that no longer fit, and she was one of the lucky ones. Some of the women in the convoy had dysentery. Others had frostbite. One had a septic wound on her thigh that smelled of rot. This was the reality of their existence when the Americans found them. They were not monsters. They were not fanatics. They were exhausted, filthy, frightened women who had spent years in a war that had devoured everything and everyone they knew, and they expected to be treated accordingly. What they expected, specifically, was violence, or indifference, or at best, bare survival. The stories that circulated among the retreating German forces painted a picture of the Americans as brutal conquerors, not as savage as the Soviets, perhaps, but still dangerous, unpredictable, capable of cruelty. Propaganda had done its work. For years, Goebbels' machine had churned out images of the enemy. American gangsters, racially impure mongrels, soft and decadent, yet somehow also ruthless and barbaric. The contradictions did not matter. Fear does not require logical consistency. But there were other stories too, quieter ones, passed in whispers during the long night marches. Stories of German soldiers who had surrendered to the Americans and been given cigarettes. Stories of towns occupied without massacres. Stories of field hospitals where wounded prisoners received morphine. These stories were harder to believe because they contradicted everything the war had taught, and yet they persisted, fragile threads of hope in the darkness. Greta did not know what to believe. She knew only that when the American convoy intercepted their retreat and the officer in charge ordered them to stop, she felt a cold knot of terror in her stomach. She knew what men did to women in war. She had heard the stories from the East. She had seen the hollow eyes of refugees who had survived Soviet occupation. She knew that female prisoners were vulnerable in ways that male prisoners were not, that the rules of war, if they ever applied differently to women, that her body was a target in a way her male comrades' bodies were not. So when the American soldier opened the truck and gestured for her to climb down, she braced herself. When he reached out to steady the older woman, she watched for the moment when the gesture would turn predatory. When she saw the canvas tent and the steaming water, she assumed it was a trick, a prelude to something worse. And then the translator said the word soap, and everything she thought she understood about the war shifted. The bars of soap were small, perhaps 3 inches long, wrapped in thin white paper stamped with the words U.S. Army. Each bar was identical, manufactured in some distant factory that had never heard a bomb fall, never smelled the smoke of a burning city, never knew the taste of hunger. To Greta, holding that bar in her hand, it felt impossibly heavy, not with physical weight, but with meaning. Soap was a luxury. Soap was civilization. Soap was the opposite of everything the war had become. The American soldiers directed the women into the tent in small groups. Inside, the air was warm and humid, thick with steam from the water drums. Wooden benches had been set up along one side. The tin basins were arranged in a row, each filled with hot water that shimmered in the lamplight. Towels, actual towels, not rags, not scraps of burlap, but thick white cotton towels, were stacked on a crate. One of the American soldiers, a medic with a red cross on his helmet, stood to the side with a clipboard. He was making notes, but his face was carefully neutral, professional. He looked at the women the way a doctor looks at patients, with clinical detachment, with focus on function rather than form. The first group of women hesitated at the entrance. They looked at the water, at the soap, at the towels, as though these objects might vanish if approached too quickly. One of them, a young woman named Elsa, who had worked in a munitions factory before being conscripted, began to cry. She cried silently, tears streaming down her dirty face, her shoulders shaking. Another woman, older, with gray hair cut short like a man's, reached out and took Elsa's hand. They stood like that for a moment. Two women holding hands in a makeshift tent in the middle of the war, and then the older woman nodded and led Elsa to one of the basins. Greta watched as the women began to wash. They moved slowly, carefully, as though they had forgotten how to perform these simple acts. They dipped their hands into water, gasped at the heat, then brought the water to their faces. They unwrapped the soap, sniffed it, rubbed it between their palms. The lather was white and clean, impossibly clean in the scent of it. Something floral, something antiseptic, filled the tent. Greta saw one woman staring at her hands covered in soap suds, transfixed, as though she could not quite believe they were real. When Greta's turn came, she approached the basin like a pilgrim approaching a shrine. She picked up the soap, felt its weight, its smoothness. She dipped her hands into the water and hissed at the heat. It had been so long since she had touched hot water, truly hot water, not the lukewarm dregs scraped from the bottom of a canteen, that it felt almost painful. She rubbed the soap between her palms, watched the lather form, brought it to her face. The smell was overwhelming. It smelled like normalcy. It smelled like her mother's bathroom in Heidelberg, like Sunday mornings before the war, like a world where cleanliness was not a privilege but a right. She washed her face, her neck, her hands. She scrubbed at the dirt under her fingernails, at the grime embedded in the lines of her palms. The water in the basin turned gray, then brown. She washed again, and again. She wanted to wash away not just the dirt, but the weeks of filth, the months of deprivation, the years of war. She wanted to scrub herself clean of everything that had happened, everything she had seen, everything she had become. When she finally stopped, her hands were shaking. She dried them on one of the white towels, and the towel came away streaked with dirt. A fresh towel was handed to her by one of the American soldiers, a tall man with kind eyes who said something in English she did not understand. She took the towel. She held it against her face. And for the first time in months, she allowed herself to believe that she might survive this after all. The distribution of soap and towels might seem, in the grand sweep of history, a trivial detail, a footnote, an anecdote of little consequence. But to the women who experienced it, it was a revelation. It was a moment when they understood that the Americans were not simply another occupying force, not simply another set of conquerors, but something fundamentally different. The soap was not just soap. It was a symbol. It was evidence of a system, an economic system, a logistical system, a moral system, that could afford to care about the cleanliness of enemy prisoners. To understand the depth of that contrast, consider the conditions Greta and her fellow prisoners had endured in the final months of the war. The German military, by 1945, was a starving, disintegrating force. Supplies were non-existent. Food was scarce. And the victors, the Americans she had been taught to fear and despise, were treating her with a decency she had not expected and perhaps did not deserve. The cognitive dissonance was overwhelming. How could the enemy be so humane? How could the propaganda have been so wrong? And if it had been wrong about this, about the Americans, about their supposed barbarism, what else had it been wrong about? She did not have answers, but she had questions. And in the weeks and months that followed, as she remained in American custody, those questions would not leave her alone. The treatment of female POWs by American forces in 1945 was not unique to Greta's experience. Across occupied Germany, similar scenes were playing out in hundreds of prisoner of war camps and holding facilities. The U.S. military, guided by the Geneva Convention and by a cultural emphasis on the humane treatment of prisoners, established protocols that prioritized basic human dignity. Captured soldiers and auxiliaries were to be fed, sheltered, and provided with medical care. They were to be protected from abuse. And, as much as battlefield conditions allowed, they were to be treated as human beings rather than as enemies to be punished. This approach was not purely altruistic. It was strategic. American military planners understood that the humane treatment of prisoners served multiple purposes. It encouraged surrenders, reducing casualties on both sides. It provided valuable intelligence, as prisoners who were treated well were more likely to cooperate. It reinforced the moral legitimacy of the Allied cause, contrasting American values with the brutality of the Axis powers. And it prepared the ground for a post-war reconstruction by demonstrating to the German people that the Allies were liberators, not conquerors. But strategy alone does not explain the individual acts of kindness that Greta and thousands of other prisoners experienced. Strategy does not explain the soldier who handed her a second piece of chocolate. Strategy does not explain the medic who comforted Elsa when she vomited. Strategy does not explain the officer who expressed hope for the survival of her brother. These were human choices, made by individual soldiers who could have been indifferent or cruel, but who chose instead to be decent. And those choices mattered. They mattered more than the grand strategies, more than the military operations, more than the speeches and the treaties, because they revealed something fundamental about the society those soldiers came from, a society that valued individual dignity, that believed in the possibility of redemption, that could afford to be generous even in victory. The soap and the towels were symbols of that society. They were small things, mundane things, things that could be easily overlooked, but they represented a system of abundance and organization that the collapsing Third Reich could not match. They represented a set of values, cleanliness, health, dignity, that had been ground into the mud of the Eastern Front and the ruins of German cities. And they represented a promise that even in the midst of war, even in the face of utter defeat, there was still a place for humanity. Greta remained in American custody for 4 months. In that time, she was transferred twice. First to a larger POW camp near Frankfurt, then to a displaced persons facility where former auxiliaries were screened and processed for release. The conditions varied from place to place, but the baseline remained the same. Food, shelter, medical care, and the fundamental expectation that prisoners would be treated as human beings. She saw things during those months that challenged everything she thought she knew. She saw Black American soldiers, men who, according to Nazi propaganda, were subhuman savages, treating German prisoners with patience and respect. She saw Jewish American officers, men whose very existence contradicted the ideology she had been raised under, distributing food and medicine without vengeance or cruelty. She saw a system that, for all its flaws and contradictions, operated on principles fundamentally different from those of the regime she had served. She also saw the ruins. As the weeks passed and the prisoners were allowed limited movement within the camps, Greta heard stories from other women. Stories of what the SS had done in the concentration camps. Stories of the industrial machinery of genocide. Stories of horrors so vast and systematic that they defied comprehension. At first, she did not believe them. She could not believe them. It was too much, too evil, too incomprehensible. But the evidence accumulated. The testimony of survivors. The photographs shown by American officers during denazification lectures. The hollow-eyed inmates liberated from Dachau and Buchenwald, who were brought to the camps to confront the German prisoners with the reality of what had been done in their name. Greta remembered sitting in a barracks hall, watching a film the Americans had compiled. Footage from Bergen-Belsen, from Auschwitz, from camps she had never heard of. She remembered the images. The piles of bodies, the skeletal survivors, the gas chambers, the crematoria. She remembered the silence in the hall, the absolute suffocating silence, as hundreds of German women sat frozen, unable to look away, unable to process what they were seeing. She remembered the woman next to her whispering, over and over, "I didn't know. I didn't know." But Greta had known, not the scale, not the systematic horror, but she had known something. Everyone had known something. They had known about the deportations. They had known about the camps. They had known that Jews disappeared and did not come back. They had known, and they had looked away, because looking was dangerous and ignorance was easier, and survival required a certain blindness. The soap and the towels took on a different meaning after that. They were not just symbols of American abundance. They were accusations. They were reminders of what civilization looked like, what decency looked like, what humanity looked like, and they stood in stark, damning contrast to what the Third Reich had become. Every clean towel was a rebuke. Every bar of soap was an indictment. Greta was released in July 1945. She was given a set of civilian clothes, donated garments from a relief organization, and a travel permit allowing her to return to Heidelberg. The city was in ruins. Her family's apartment building had been bombed. Her mother was living in a church basement with 30 other refugees. Her father had not returned from the war. Her brother was officially listed as missing, presumed dead. She moved through the shattered streets of her hometown like a ghost. Everything was broken. The bridges, the buildings, the people. Germany had been defeated utterly, humiliated, occupied, divided. The ideology that had promised a 1,000-year Reich had delivered 12 years of catastrophe. And the survivors, the ones who remained, were left to sift through the rubble, trying to understand what had happened, how it had happened, why they had allowed it to happen. Greta found work eventually, translating documents for the American occupation authorities. It was ironic, in a way. She had spent the war encoding German military communications, and now she was helping the Americans decode the bureaucratic remnants of the Nazi state. But the work gave her a sense of purpose, and the Americans paid in occupation marks that could be exchanged for food, and slowly, incrementally, life began to resemble something other than mere survival. She never forgot the soap. Years later, after the war had faded into history, after Germany had rebuilt, after the economic miracle had transformed the ruins into a prosperous, democratic state, she still remembered the weight of that small white bar in her hand. She remembered the smell, the lather, the hot water in the tin basin. She remembered the American soldier with the soft jaw, the medic with the kind eyes, the officer who had hoped her brother made it home. She told the story to her children. Years later, trying to explain what the war had been like, what the Americans had been like, how the experience had changed her. Her children, born into a world of peace and prosperity, struggled to understand. To them, soap was just soap. But to Greta, it had been proof. Proof that another world was possible, that cruelty was not inevitable, that even in the depths of war, decency could survive. The story of female POWs being offered soap and towels is not a story of grand battles or heroic deeds. It is a story of small gestures in a time of immense suffering. But those small gestures carried outsized significance because they revealed the values of society behind them. The Americans who distributed soap and towels to German prisoners in 1945 were not saints. They were ordinary men, soldiers doing their jobs, following orders and acting on impulses shaped by the culture they came from. But that culture, a culture of abundance, of individualism, of pragmatic humanism, shaped those impulses toward kindness rather than cruelty, toward dignity rather than degradation. For the women who experienced that kindness, it was transformative. It shattered the propaganda they had internalized. It forced them to confront uncomfortable questions about the regime they had served and the enemies they had feared. It planted seeds of doubt that would grow, in the years to come, into a fundamental rethinking of identity, ideology, and history. The soap was more than soap. It was a bridge between worlds, between the world of total war and the world of reconstruction, between the ideology of hatred and the possibility of reconciliation, between the depths of barbarism and the stubborn persistence of civilization. It was a small thing, a mundane thing, easily overlooked in the grand narrative of the war. But for Greta Hoffman and thousands of women like her, standing in a cold forest in March 1945, holding a bar of white soap wrapped in paper stamped with the words U.S. Army, it was a moment when everything changed. It was a moment when they understood that the war was over, not just militarily, but morally, that the side they had served had not only lost, but had been wrong, and that the side they had feared had been right. Not in every particular, not without flaws or contradictions, but in the fundamental belief that even enemies deserve to be treated as human beings. That is the power of a bar of soap. That is the power of a clean towel, not as objects in themselves, but as symbols of a system, a society, a set of values that could afford to be humane even in the midst of total war. It is a lesson worth remembering. In an age that sometimes forgets the fragility of civilization, the ease with which decency can be discarded, and the importance of small gestures that affirm our common humanity. The war ended. The prisoners went home. The soap was used and discarded. But the memory remained. A memory of kindness in the midst of cruelty, of cleanliness in the midst of filth, of humanity in the midst of war. And that memory, more than any treaty or occupation or reconstruction plan, helped to build the bridge from the darkness of the past to the hope of the future. In the forests of central Germany, In March 1945, American soldiers offered soap and towels to enemy prisoners. It was a small thing. It changed everything.